just start the meeting and see if we can get to quorum before we have to approve the minutes from the last meeting, right? So I said already good morning to everybody who joins us today to this July Climate, Energy, and Environment Policy Committee meeting. I am Takis Karantonis. I'm the chair this year, and I'm also a member of the Arlington County Board. Allow me just for a second a few introductory thoughts. I will spare you the grandiloquent introductions, that the world is actually burning, and all the gallows humor that we hear this day, enjoying the coolest July of the rest of our lives, or the rest of the lives of future generations. So in this room, I doubt that there's anybody present who doubts that we need to act, and that we need to act extremely expeditiously to reduce emissions if we want to have a hope that we will avoid at least the worst climate implications of where we are today, and the course of emissions and potentiation of the greenhouse effect that we have to deal with today. One area that's extremely effective, where we can be very effective is the electrification of buildings. The term has become ubiquitous in the concept of identifying where we have most short-term leverage to actually change things on the level of local governments. After all, the electrification of buildings, according to USGBC, represents about 31%, a third, of energy-related CO2 emissions. So having said that, which was, what motivated, and I believe what motivated COG staff to be extremely helpful and supportive in getting this session together with a centerpiece on building electrification. I have some announcements to make before we move into committee business. The Regional Electric Vehicle Deployment Working Group, which is a working group under CEEPC, has this month officially launched the EV Clearinghouse, including a newly published local government EV Ready website. And I really encourage you, if you haven't done so already, to visit that and write comments and give us your feedback. That applies to your staff as well. This begins to be an extremely valuable resource. I had a great time crawling through the different things, the map that they publish, and the other resources, policy resources, and repository of ideas, as I very often used to refer to it. Last week also kicked off a project to develop a regional EV infrastructure implementation strategy, of which we'll hear more about today during the updates from the committee. I also want to note that we received a letter of public comment. This is posted with the materials for this meeting, so I encourage you to go online and read that. It's from Mr. Aborn. You have received in other COG committees the same public comments from Mr. Aborn before. So this is in our published part of the proceedings of this committee. Maya, how are we doing with quorum?
We have met quorum, Chairman.
Hey, that's awesome. Thank you so much for that. So we can go ahead and adopt the meeting summary from CEEPC's May meeting. I'd like to have, if there is a motion, to adopt the May CEEPC summary. Councilmember Dybala.
So move.
And properly seconded. So are there any changes or amendments to the minutes? Sorry, to the summary. No. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Okay, any abstentions, any votes against? Hearing none, the ayes have it. So let's move over to the second part of our agenda today, committee and member updates. So Don Ashbacher from BIAC, from our Building and Environment Energy Advisory Committee, is first on the list.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair Karen Tonis, and thank you for your poignant remarks to open us this morning. The main discussion topic today on building electrification is of particular interest to BIAC, as the committee has been looking at these aggressive strategies for quite some time and finding out ways to employ them in our individual jurisdictions. So I'd like to highlight some related efforts BIAC has engaged in over the last several years. In June of 2020, BIAC had its first meeting in a series called Net Zero Emissions and Building Decarbonization. In that series, we learned from experts like the New Buildings Institute on the 5 foundations of zero carbon building policies. And we learned that the 5 foundations are energy efficiency, renewable energy, grid integration and storage, building electrification, and embodied carbon. That series also included a discussion with the Carbon Leadership Forum on strategies to reduce embodied carbon in the building sector. And in 2021, BIAC continued looking at building decarbonization with a panel on moving beyond code. NBI discussed their decarbonization code overlay for building electrification. This code language is an overlay to the 2021 International Energy Conservation Code that transforms energy codes into decarbonization codes for new buildings by paving the way for building electrification. NBI also has model decarbonization code language for existing buildings, which BIAC has not yet engaged, but hopes to do so at some point. Now that some jurisdictions have building electrification language in their climate action plans, we're looking at grid implications. We started this in April, which included a discussion with the Electric Power Research Institute on impacts and opportunities for equitable decarbonization. We heard about equitable clean energy transition strategies related to policy development, electrification, and power generation. And in June, we had our first meeting in a series on grid integration that was called Energy Transition, Building Integration, and the Future of the Electric Grid. In September, in a joint meeting, BIAC and the Regional Electric Vehicle Deployment Working Group, or REVD, will collectively look at zoning and building codes as it relates to electric vehicle charging. Zoning and building codes are 2 action areas listed in the local jurisdiction electric vehicle ready checklist that you mentioned, and COG staff developed this as part of REVD's work group. You'll hear more about that in the work group's update. And our second meeting in the grid series is scheduled for November 16th, when we hope to engage NBI again on their Grid Optimal Buildings Initiative, which are a standardized set of metrics that measure and quantify a building's contribution to the grid. That's all I have today. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. That's always very interesting for me to absorb and to receive. Next is ACPAC, our community committee, advisory committee. Maya Davis is providing an update from them.
Thank you, Chair Karen Tonis. ACPAC Chair Era Pandia has a conflict today, and our lead staff for ACPAC is also out of the office this week, so I will be giving the update today. The 2023 Climate and Energy Leadership Awards program ended on June 30th, and we are excited to report that 17 applications were submitted. We got 6 applications in the government sector, 7 NGO, and 4 education. ACPAC met on July 17th to review and judge the applications. We are working on final scoring. And in August, the 3 winners will be selected. The winners will be announced at the October COG board meeting, which is expected to be in person. ACPAC's next meeting is September 18th, 2023. Thank you.
Thank you, Maya. The next is an update from the regional electric vehicle deployment working group. Robert Christopher is here to report.
Thank you, Chair Karantonis. So I'm pleased to provide you all with an update on the recent work of the Regional Electric Vehicle Deployment Working Group. As Chair Karantonis mentioned, the local jurisdiction EV Ready checklist has been published on the EV Clearinghouse. This checklist serves as a tool for local governments and stakeholders to assess and enhance their community's readiness for EV adoption. It covers best practices, examples, and resources in the areas of community planning, zoning, building codes, permitting and inspections, government fleets, public outreach, and public safety and security. The checklist is a resource to assist COG members with EV deployment strategies. Also, as the chair announced, we are excited to share that the Regional Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Implementation Strategy has been launched. This strategic document provides a roadmap for the development of an extensive and reliable electric vehicle charging infrastructure network throughout our region. The implementation strategy will include 1. County and regional EV ownership projections for the years 2030, 2035, and 2045. 2. An EV infrastructure needs assessment interactive map. And 3. A report overview of regional EV deployment implementation, as well as a snapshot for each county detailing projections for EVs and priority areas for EV infrastructure deployment. As we move forward, we encourage COG members to leverage the resources available through the EV Clearinghouse, utilize the EV Ready checklist to assess and enhance their readiness, and actively participate in the implementation of the Regional Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Implementation Strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Christopher. All very exciting stuff. And I have to say, I crawled through the website and I'm doing that almost, 3 times a week already now. So I really recommend that to everybody to do and to actually provide feedback on this work. Next on my list, on our list, is a Clean Cities update. Mr. Thompson, Antoine Thompson is with us.
Good morning to everyone. Good to be with you today. Just a couple quick updates. First is the office is working on a fleet equity guide that will be released in October. And so that will allow you all to, as you are leading your electrification efforts, take into consideration different strategies to make sure those things are being done in an equitable manner. So that'll be released in October at our conference, which will be October 4th at Homewood Suites in Largo, Maryland. So that's October 4th. We'll have our annual conference. We'll have our ride and drive. We'll have a green procurement expo, a number of panels and things like that. One of the things that we love to get some involvement from some of the folks on this, we are going to be holding 6 roundtables around accelerating biodiesel and electrification at our fueling stations in the region. A lot of these fueling stations are some of them are starting to offer EV charging. As you all know, this SMART group knows that everyone is not going to be able to charge at home. So some stations are starting to move. It's really hard to find biodiesel in the area. Diesel fuel is rampant in our region. And so it's going to be around for the next 40, 50 years. So why not try to have a cleaner form of diesel? So we'll have some roundtables on that, and we'll hopefully some of you can participate in those discussions with local both public and private fueling stations, because many of you have fueling stations that have diesel in them, right? And so we want to get a cleaner form of diesel as well. The other thing I wanted to mention that we are doing, we just got a couple grants from the feds, and one of them is going to be around workforce development, providing some training for EV pre-apprenticeship work and technician training as well. That'll hopefully roll out in October. As that moves forward, I know all of us, everyone needs help with getting their existing and emerging workforce ready on how to work on EVs, electric vehicles. So those are kind of the top line. Oh, last thing I wanted to mention, many of you are offering workplace charging, or your workplace has committed to charging. If you have, your workplace is committed to offering charging for workers, let us know, because we're trying to, one, recognize people that are doing that, but also get people to sign the pledge. And if you're already doing it, that's even better. We have a DOE project where we're trying to get, a couple hundred companies, both public and private, to make a pledge that they will offer workplace charging. So if you're already doing it, we'll send an email around and you can say, yeah, we already do it. Let us be officially on the record. So I'll end with those things. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. All very interesting. I look forward to the October 4th event, and I really think that the issue of the equity lens on EV deployment and the electrification of individual transportation is, to me, really one of the hardest nuts to crack here policy-wise. So I really appreciate your input on this and your advice. The next update comes from the recycling committee. Adam Rigo is with us.
Yes, thank you, Chair Karantonis. Just a couple quick updates. The recycling committee met last week to discuss the topic of C&D, or construction demolition waste. We heard from several presenters about the national state of C&D recycling. These materials tend to be much harder to recycle, with a lot fewer opportunities than a lot of the consumer packaging, which I think most of us are familiar with. We also heard from a regional facility that's doing some of this, and then a presentation from San Antonio, who's done a lot of work around the deconstruction of buildings and reuse of materials. Additionally, the recycling committee just concluded at the end of June our annual Go Recycle campaign, which is about a $70,000 media buy across social media, radio, to promote just good recycling behaviors across jurisdictions in the region. So it's a coordinated effort. We believe it was a successful campaign. We had several million impressions across the different media platforms that we were involved in. And so again, a successful campaign that just helps people remember the do's and don'ts of their recycling programs. The committee will meet again September 21st for our next meeting. And that's all I've got. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rido. I apologize that I mispronounced your last name before. So thank you for the update. On to regional updates from our CEEPC members here. Please share. I will go from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. I am only going to ask you to be brief, so as not to take more than a minute or so, since we have a packed agenda and we want to stay on time. So do we have any updates from the District of Columbia? I don't see any. Do we have any updates from the state of Maryland, from jurisdictions in Maryland? No July updates from Maryland. Virginia. Well, I think that we are all focused on the next item, right? So I appreciate that we can carve some extra time from that. Mind you that you can always use the chat function or just email us and we will share updates from any jurisdiction anytime. This is what we are here, and and COG staff has been always extremely helpful with this. So on to the centerpiece of our meeting today, or at least in my opinion, the centerpiece of our meeting today. We have here three amazing professionals: Matthew Vasilakis, who's managing director of the Building Electrification Institute; Diana Burke and David Smeding. Diana Burke is with the New Buildings Institute. She's a project manager of zero carbon building codes, and this is quite an important part. And David Smeding is the Rocky Mountain Institute manager, and he's an expert in carbon-free buildings. So I will ask our panelists here to first to introduce themselves for maybe not more than 5 minutes each, to introduce their work and how they, what parts of the what focus of their work they want to highlight here today to this committee. And then I will call on CEEPC members who have submitted questions for this panel in advance, and thank you so much for being so forthcoming with that. And I will ask you to limit your questions to maybe the most important one or two questions that you have, so that we can get through a fair amount of questions and have a good broad conversation on the topic today. So Mr. Vasilakis, Matthew, I will start with you, and then I will ask every panelist to introduce themselves and talk about 5 minutes about their work and how they approach the topic.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. Hello, everyone. My name is Matthew Vasilakis, he, him pronouns. San Diego based with the Building Electrification Institute. BEI equips cities and communities with the knowledge, skills, and resources they need to co-create ambitious and equitable strategies to accelerate building electrification. We currently work in 12 cities across the country, including Washington, D.C., providing critical research, analysis, and ongoing direct support, working hand in hand with city staff to accelerate the development and implementation of new policies and programs. We also collaborate with key partners to influence state, regional, and federal policies, translating best practices from cutting-edge local initiatives that center the needs of historically marginalized communities. We have a strong commitment to equity, and in the district right now, we are partnered with the DC Department of Energy and Environment and the National Housing Trust on an equitable electrification community engagement project to learn from and support traditionally marginalized communities in their transition to a more healthy, safe, and affordable fossil fuel-free future that also helps DC meet its greenhouse gas reduction targets. So that's my spiel, and I'm really excited to be here to answer any questions and support the work that you all are doing here at this very important table. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vasilakis. Ms. Burke? Dana?
Yes.
Diana.
My name is Diana Burke, and I'm a senior project manager on the Codes and Policy team at NBI, or New Buildings Institute. NBI is a nonprofit that works for better buildings that achieve zero energy, zero carbon, and beyond through research, policy, guidance, and market transformation. At NBI, I personally work at both the national and local level to advance energy codes, which are minimum requirements for new construction. I'm a member of the Commercial Committee to develop the 2024 International Energy Conservation Code. As a member of that committee, NBI has introduced requirements into that code to encourage efficient electrification, as well as optional appendices that jurisdictions can adopt to require electric-ready infrastructure in buildings, as well as require all electric buildings. On a local level, my colleagues and I have helped DC update its building code to require electrification in new buildings, and we've helped DC think through which building types and uses should be exempt from those electrification requirements. We've also worked to help Montgomery County update its code. Outside of the Mid-Atlantic, I've worked to establish Illinois Stretch Energy Code, which will require electric-ready infrastructure and includes electrification incentives. And I've also been involved in helping establish New York State's Stretch Energy Code, which, because of recently passed legislation, will now require all new buildings 7 stories and lower to be all electric. In addition, I've helped develop resources to encourage policies for electrification. I conducted analysis on NBI's building decarbonization code to better understand the cost impacts of that code on both construction and operation. And I was involved in developing NBI's existing building decarbonization code. And I believe that at that, I'm also excited to talk to this committee. You guys are doing fantastic work, and excited about the conversation ahead.
Thank you, Diana. On to David Smedick.
Sure thing. Thanks, folks. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all today. My name's David Smedick. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a federal policy manager on RMI's Carbon-Free Buildings team. RMI is a global nonprofit. We're intensely focused on transforming the global energy system, secure a clean and prosperous zero carbon future for all. We work on techno-economic analysis to support policy and market transformation initiatives across geographies, across the globe, at the local, state, national, and global level. We have programs that are focused on key energy sectors, electricity, transportation. I myself work on the buildings team, and we'll dive into that a little bit more. But we also do, again, support geographies focus as well in different programs, island nations, the US government, India, as well as many others. Our carbon-free buildings team, though, which we're going to chat through those topics today, we have about 60 folks across our team all working together to have the sector's emissions by 2030 and reach net zero by around mid-century. We kind of approach it holistically, working to reduce embodied carbon emissions in construction materials and operations as well. And we work to increase energy efficiency and electrify the building stock as that holistic approach to reduce emissions across the sector. About half of the team works on a variety of things, whether it's deep analysis, direct project support for decarbonizing tall buildings in New York City, and other parts of the globe. We have folks that work on projects to provide deep energy retrofits in a kind of holistic way across building shell, electrification, solar, et cetera. And then we have folks where on my team, we sit in the policy space where we kind of take those learnings from the market transformation team and try to support policy change, again, at that local, state, and national level. For myself, like I mentioned, I focus on federal policy, primarily at RMI. So that has translated, as you all can imagine, and are dealing with now, lately into just implementation of the Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. And so there's billions and billions and billions of dollars flowing down to state and local governments from the federal government to decarbonize the building stock. And that's an exciting time. It's a challenging time, but it's something that I think we really need to harness, and something I'd like to chat with you all about a little bit more, hear about what you're working on, what the challenges are, and how RMI and the federal government can be a little bit more responsive to some of those local challenges. The only other thing that I'll mention before I get into this, my local tie-in here as well, I live in Baltimore. I'm a commissioner on the Maryland Commission on Climate Change and have been involved in their support for the state of Maryland to respond to and create plans to meet their nation-leading climate action targets, 60% by 2031, and excited to dive into all those key pieces over the next couple of years as Maryland tries to decarbonize its building sector in that work too. My last point before I hand it back to you all for discussion, I want to emphasize what Matthew and Diana said about equity concerns as well in this space, and something RMI is really dedicated to, and I myself, it's what drew me to work in the building sector in particular. I think the opportunity in front of us to holistically retrofit the building stock, especially for homeowners across the country, is fundamentally critical when we're looking at health and safety, energy efficiency, utility bills, reducing pollution. It's such a huge opportunity that gets me excited every day. Chat with you folks. I'm thrilled that this kind of conversation happens at COG frequently enough that you all can talk across your different stakeholders and institutes for it. So anyway, I'll stop rambling and excited to dive into stuff. Thanks.
Thank you, David. Thank you, all three of you, for being here today. As I believe you cannot imagine how much interest there is in the topic you're discussing today, and it's not only for today; it's on the long term. We need a lot of input from people like you who are working so networked in the nation and across different jurisdictions to help us understand where we get the maximum bang for the buck the fastest, and where we are most effective in reducing emissions yesterday, if possible. So I'm going to jump forward in the Q&A portion, discussion portion of this meeting. I would, as I told you before, I will call CEEPC members who have submitted already questions in advance. And I thank you all for having done that. And I will start with Council Member Cindy Dybala from Tacoma, Maryland, Tacoma Park, sorry, to ask her a couple of questions first. Thank you.
Nothing like starting out with the heart of the project here. So my questions have to do with smaller, older buildings in the DMV area and across the country. There are a lot of people, many of whom fit the equity guidelines that we've all been talking about, who live in smaller, older, multifamily buildings. And before you can get to electrification, there's repair, rehab, there's tenant education, energy efficiency, building work, envelope work. There's a lot that has to happen first. So what models are out there, if any, for smaller buildings and their tenants and landlords? And what's your advice on putting a package together? Because it's a tough subset of buildings emissions, and yet it's one of the most important in this area. Thank you. Stunned silence. Oh, come on, it's not that hard.
Well, it is hard, but we have good experts here to answer these.
Thank you for being here.
Well, I'll just start off by saying it is an incredibly complex problem to begin with. So I really appreciate that recognition, especially for smaller multifamily buildings, and just given all the different typologies that exist out there in the building housing stock. At a high level, I will say, what we're noticing and what we've worked on in a lot of our cities is having conversations and developing regional one-stop shops so that folks have a place to go when these types of projects need to be done. So, we really encourage cities to look at partnering, especially if smaller jurisdictions where they have a lot of smaller multifamily buildings or single family homes, like have conversations with your neighboring cities about like, how do we pull resources together? How do we create these programs and accelerators? Larger cities like New York and Denver are building or have accelerators or have one-stop shop entities that, pull together like, what type of building do you have? Here's the contracting ecosystem. Here are the funding and rebates. Here are the incentives. Here's the case manager that you have that's going to walk you through this process together. And for a lot of smaller jurisdictions, that's incredibly helpful, because then that they can pool their resources, they can reduce the administrative burden on their end, and then they know that they can direct their community members to those places to get those answers put together. Now, I also want to just kind of highlight that it's important for said local jurisdictions to also do a deep dive and understand the nuances of their own community. So that's factored into the one-stop shop, because you don't want to have anyone that shows up and be like, well, actually, we don't know how to address that. But again, I really want to encourage folks to have conversations, and this is why this forum is so important, but to have those conversations together so that you can develop these types of entities, these types of one-stop shops, these accelerators, so that folks have a place to go. There's a starting point. And yeah, there's a lot more nuance, of course, to that. You've got to do it. It's really hard to set these programs up. They're incredibly complex organisms in themselves, but they pay off immensely in the long run in just giving people the assurance that they know they can go someplace and have the information they need to do what they need to do. And in addition to that, pairing it, of course, with funding. It's going to take quite a bit of funding at a local, state, and federal level. So yeah, just to kick that off to start the conversation.
And before the other two speakers have a chance to respond, I just want to throw this out for the CEEPC committee and for the CEEPC staff, whether there is not the funding part, but the one-stop shop part, whether there's a germ of an idea here that we might be wanting to talk about and build towards in the next few months here. So I'd love to hear what the other two panelists have to say. Thank you.
You want to go for it, Diana, or I can jump in?
You go first. I'll go next.
Okay, cool. Really love what Matthew started with. And that one-stop shop idea, I think, is you could have an entire like 4-hour conversation with this group about it, and probably many, many times after that. But a couple examples on that. I think one that we really like to highlight that's within the Mid-Atlantic as well is within Philadelphia, the Built to Last program. Is a one-stop shop example that the city of Philadelphia kind of pulled together. They have, I think, over 20 different funding streams. It's flowing into a one-stop shop kind of portal where the consumer actually really only has to apply once. And then on the back end, the admin burden does fall on the staff there to kind of sort through what different funding streams they're eligible for, et cetera, to provide the retrofit example. But the Philadelphia Built to Last program, and we can share those resources with the COG staff, is a good example of that. I'll even shout out, I don't know all the details on it, but I think I saw yesterday that Governor Moore and Secretary Day in Maryland announced $4 million for a holistic retrofit program that they're launching, whole home style. So I don't know all the details there. I think I just saw a press release, but you're starting to see that concept come up a lot more, so that when you're looking at a whole home retrofit, and when I mention whole home retrofit, I'm thinking of addressing health and safety issues that you need to address, whether it's lead remediation, mold remediation, pest control. If there are structural damage, if there's roof issues, then you can't do the weatherization pieces. You start there, but then at the same time, you're addressing the energy efficiency and building shell problems. You are electrifying appliances and providing energy assistance, whether that's direct bill assistance and plugging people into programs to make sure they can pay their bills, or access to clean energy to help drive down additional electricity costs. So those 4 pillars of a whole home retrofit, I think, are kind of the best one-stop shop examples out there. Again, health and safety, energy efficiency, electrification, and energy assistance. One area that I'll put my federal hat on to help with, I think the flow of federal funding now is the perfect time for local, state, and regional governments to be kind of imagining those one-stop shops, because you're getting so much funding in direct rebates, the tax credits that are available to consumers and building owners now. It's an opportunity to see how those interact with your state and utility programs as well, and how they can actually provide funding streams to single buildings, and so that you can actually get more holistic retrofits as a part of that. There are some examples at the federal government between HUD, Housing and Urban Development, coordinating a little bit with Department of Energy. I think that could happen a lot more on some of their pieces, but weatherization plus health and weatherization plus mold, lead remediation, there are some funding opportunities where folks could apply to HUD and US DOE for kind of combining those programs as some examples. But love where we started that conversation. I think we could dive into it a lot more, but I'll step back and let Diana chime in.
Yeah, Cindy, that was a great question and also a very tough nut to crack. From my perspective, I feel like I have sort of 2 answers to that question. One is we need to stop building inefficient, smaller multifamily buildings and make sure new multifamily buildings are up to par, that they're as energy efficient as possible, and that they're electrified, because that's really the easiest, most cost-effective moment in time to make that happen. Which leads me to the importance of strong building codes. Once the building is built, once it's an existing building, I think the most opportune times to retrofit that building is when work is already being done, when the building is going to be renovated. When we developed our existing building decarb code, we looked at those sort of trigger points for when retrofits are happening and ensured that those retrofits happened in a way that encouraged efficient electrification. So for example, if you're doing a substantial improvement, if you're doing basically a gut rehab of that small multifamily building, we want to make sure that that building renovation actually leads to a more efficient building and leads to the replacement of fossil fuel equipment with electric equipment. Another sort of requirement that I think a lot of jurisdictions are considering for existing buildings is requiring the replacement of air conditioning units with heat pump units. I think that's a really interesting and really key sort of point when you're replacing your AC unit. You could just replace it with a heat pump unit to provide both heating and cooling, and use the existing furnace or heating system as that backup heat. And that's a really key trigger point in a existing building. But again, yeah, that multifamily buildings and residential buildings, I think, are really, really important, but harder sector to crack.
Well, thank you for these insights. I want to make sure that we are collecting all the references that we get here from existing programs, etc. So there is a plethora of them, and we appreciate your input and insight on what to look, what solutions look like, and so that we have something to adapt. I can only say. I spend a lot of time to find ways to retrofit old brick, and I can tell you that the engineering proposals are there. The question is how we make it economically happen, because at the same time, this very often is also affordable housing stock. The financing of any rehab is a complicated lasagna deal thing, and it's very difficult sometimes to afford the extra expense of for example, implementing a good heat pump system or so. So we'll talk more about that. I want to go over to now for more questions to Ms. Ashbacher, who is here, Dawn Ashbacher from Maryland. She had a couple of questions as well, several actually, but I hope the two highlights.
Yes, thank you, Chair Karantonis. So I have two questions that I'll start with. One is a very general question and one is a very specific question. So the general question is, what are model building codes for electrification? And I think there are some resources on the webpage. And then the more specific question is, so we in Frederick County have a county-owned building that's 200,000 square feet. We recently acquired it. It has a relatively new gas boiler, and I'm told it would take something like 75 heat pumps to replace that gas boiler. So what are some options for cost-effective options for electrification of that type of building?
I'll answer the first question. So what are model building codes for electrification? As you mentioned, Don, NBI has created a building decarbonization code as an overlay to the 2021 IECC. And that code focuses on the 5 foundations: efficiency, electrification, renewable energy, and grid integration. It does not yet include embodied carbon. That is one resource. In addition to that, as a member of the 2024 International Energy Conservation Code Committee, those codes, the next edition of those codes, which will be released at the end of this year or early next year, and will be available for adoption by jurisdictions, those codes include optional appendices. In the commercial code, there's an optional electric ready appendix for jurisdictions that aren't yet ready to require full electrification in buildings. And then there's also an optional all electric appendix. In the residential code, the main body of the code will actually include electric ready requirements. And then there will be an optional appendix for all electric buildings. So once that code is available for adoption, I'm excited about states and cities that have the opportunity to adopt those optional appendices. In addition, we've created, as I said, an existing building decarbonization code that is it's also an overlay to the 2021, but addresses existing buildings in a more holistic way to encourage that efficient electrification, encourage the replacement of HVAC systems with the right controls, the right sizing of those HVAC systems, and for jurisdictions that are interested, require those replacements to be electric. And I will stop there. As for your question on the large building with natural gas boilers, I will just say that is the hardest building type to electrify. I'm wondering if David or Matthew have an answer for that one. Thanks.
Yes, and just before we switch over, which I'm looking forward to the answer, you said the optional appendices are from the 2024, or which year did you mention?
Yes, it will be in the 2024 code, which has been released in draft form, but won't be final until the end of this year or early next year. But those appendices were based on a proposal that we submitted to the committee, and those committees are like 45 people, so they suggested improvements to that code language, and it'll be released, yeah, soon.
Other comments on this? On the difficulty of retrofitting?
I'll jump in just briefly because as Diana mentioned, that kind of building typology is definitely one of the hardest and the biggest questions that's out there, and I think it'll take additional time to like really figure all of the nuances out. There are solutions, and we've seen some large buildings and even some industrial applications of heat pumps. I'd say that our friends over in Europe are a little bit farther along in their work with large heat pump technology and industrial heat pump technology. So we can be sure to share some reports and resources and case studies that have come out of our European colleagues. The European Heat Pump Association has done quite a bit of research and practical experience with large heat pumps to replace some of those historically fossil-fired large boilers and systems. The other thing that I'll just throw out there, I'm not sure how applicable it is because again, every building will be different, but putting on a federal hat, you mentioned about making some of those changes economical for large buildings and structures. One tax incentive that I'm in the process still of learning even more about with its updates through the Inflation Reduction Act, but the investment tax credit 48, provides around 30% tax credit for clean energy projects, and within that is geothermal systems, geothermal heating systems. A lot of people think of it as commercial scale solar, wind, other clean energy resources, but geothermal for larger scale applications actually fits in that tax credit 48. So researching that, see if there's an opportunity for talking with tax attorneys and engineers and everything, seeing the application of geothermal under that space could be one avenue forward. But as Diana mentioned, that's the tough nut to crack moving forward is some of those larger ones. So I don't know, Matthew, if you had anything else you wanted to add, though.
In detail, but I guess what I am encouraged to hear is that y'all are looking at this specific problem. What we've noticed in a lot of jurisdictions is that they'll start with the lowest hanging fruit and be like, all right, well, we'll tackle this first and see where we can go. And our philosophy is to do the exact opposite, like tackle the most challenging components of this effort first. So that way, everything else is a bit more seamless and you can understand kind of the bigger point. And then I really appreciate David's elevation of network geothermal. We're seeing a lot of pilots of that in the Northeast in particular, and we think that could be a really unique opportunity to problem solve for some of these larger, older housing stock typologies. So yeah, wish I had a clear-cut answer to say this is the technology you want to use. And also shout out to Diana for that excellent run-through on the code opportunity. No additions there.
Thank you. Tough one. There are no easy. We don't do easy. Nothing we do here, right? And I usually wear my T-shirt that says "Where is a will, there is a way." So, but you know, I'm not always successful with that, but at least I can advance some, at least in my experience. So next to Amanda Campbell from the city of Rockville in Maryland as well. A couple of questions. Is Amanda with us?
Hi there. Hi there. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead.
I must have missed the email where it's teed up to ask questions, but I certainly have plenty. And yeah, one was about you know, retrofitting low income housing. And you know, I think that there's going to be a lot of putting our heads together, thinking about what kind of messaging, what kind of outreach strategies, and that kind of thing are going to help people move along into this. We've had some challenges doing free weatherization for our low income homeowners, just because there's so little trust. I think there's a lack of trust in the community about someone knocking on your door telling you, oh, I've got this great deal for you. And, you know, how do we be thoughtful about that and meet people where they are? And then my second question is also, I guess it's kind of a broader question about affordability. How do we make sure that, you know, if we're retrofitting these buildings, you know, say if we're working with landlords, because a lot of low income housing is, you know, rentals and things like that. How do we ensure that after we do the retrofits that then the affordability disappears, and that, you know, now that it's like a premium building, you know, with nice amenities and things like that, that it doesn't, you know, become then more expensive. So we just have a lot of, I think, thinking to do around this effort, but I'm very excited about the opportunity that we have here and looking forward to working with everybody.
So I think the question was embedded in the comments. If the panel wants to comment a little bit on these.
Yeah, I can start, and it's a really great comment, and one I really appreciate hearing is the importance of trust and having conversations with communities about this issue, because there isn't a lot of trust, especially in marginalized and low-income communities that have been, you know, just really historically disadvantaged by how government operates and works. And so when they're, you know, you present them with an apple, it comes with a, well, is this poisoned? Like, what is this opportunity here? And I don't understand. In addition to that, it's the relevancy of it. It's like, cool, you want to talk to me about getting new windows for efficiency? What exactly how that helps me? GHG reduction? What? Which is why it's really important to start the conversation with, you know, what is the situation? What is your world? What is going on in your life? What are the impacts, the day-to-day pressures? And what you end up coming out with are, you know, energy costs, burdens, quality of life issues, health and safety. And then if there is any tie-in, you know, an opportunity to talk about, like, well, what about like the environment? What about greenhouse, you know, gases, if you want to use that term? So what this really means is you need to have a conversation with them about where they are at, what's important and relevant to them, and then what are the tie-ins in terms of what you're trying to provide them, and say, oh, actually, like, if we really want to talk about, you know, your concerns over, you know, the health and safety of your home, then, you know, we've got this really exciting and cool program that could, you know, help you reduce your energy costs and provide a healthier place for your family to be raised and grow. And that really comes back to what we really encourage cities to do, and we work and partner with Washington, D.C. on, is community co-creation, and really looking at that and understanding, you know, how do we collaborate and defer to these folks in terms of how these policies and programs and projects are shaped, so that there is complete buy-in. And there are multiple tactics and strategies on how to do that, but it really is just having face-to-face conversations with community members who then understand and become champions, and then go to their neighbors and talk about it and build that momentum. Because we, as like folks who are city staff, who are eggheads in the climate and energy world, like, we're just not going to be able to connect with folks in that way, in an authentic way. But when we see that growth of knowledge in the community, and they're translating it to their neighbors and to their family members, there is a proliferation of success that can happen. So really it is, you know, understanding, you know, what's going on the ground, building those initial relationships, working with community-based organizations, working with stakeholders, and building those that knowledge set so that they can go out and be champions for these initiatives as well. And yeah, so my high level answer for now. And there's lots of nuance there, by the way. So happy to dig into that further.
Any other comments?
I'll jump in briefly and mention, I think, Amanda, you asked about, correct me if I'm wrong, some of the tenant protections that could be associated post retrofit to make sure rent doesn't get skyrocketed, gentrification doesn't happen too much, those kinds of things. And that is definitely a critical issue as we're looking forward on these pieces. I'll reference a couple pieces. There are federal requirements or guidelines through HUD, through some of the Weatherization Assistance Program measures as well that have reporting requirements from the landlords or the folks that have received some of the upgrades. So I can share those resources again. I don't know them intimately, but we've got a number of them that we've included. Again, my brain is a lot of IRA focused right now, but when we were providing feedback to the Department of Energy for how to structure the rebate programs coming up, we included references to things that California has done, I think even some that Maryland has done, and HUD and DOE have done in the low-income housing tax credit program, and other HUD-assisted properties that make sure that the tenant protections are within there. So I can share those later, but it's a way that maybe local governments as well could start adopting some of those if they're not already in place to help make sure that's part of the process.
Can I ask a quick follow-up that if you know of specific, if Matthew knows of specific, other states or local governments that have been doing that like deep outreach work in this space that we can look to?
Yeah, well, one place you can have a really great conversation is at DC DOEE. We're working with the National Housing Trust on this deep community engagement effort in the communities that they manage and work with so that we can, again, build that trust on the ground, have ambassadors who can go into the community and have conversations with their partners. And there are other jurisdictions. We're working on that project in San Diego. We're working on that in Berkeley. Denver's leading on that front as well. So there are a lot of places and spaces. It's just a matter of, how do we contextualize that locally? Who are the community-based organizations in your community that you could start having a conversation with? Who are the community stakeholders that really want to be leaders in this space because they understand the importance and nexus, and not only in terms of reducing emissions, which we all really care about, but also improving the quality of life for folks who have been historically left behind by government. So we have a ton of resources on our website, by the way, and I'll include links in the chat afterwards, and I'm sure we can post things out. But yeah, there's a lot of great work being done in that trust building. It's just, I think the other thing I'll really emphasize, it takes time. And sometimes that can be really frustrating with the tension of the climate crisis. Like we want to accelerate and move as quickly and scale, but we also need to make sure that folks aren't turned off by this change if we're not addressing their needs first and foremost, because then they'll shut down the policy levers by going to their decision makers, their elected officials, and saying, what the hell are you doing? And then the whole project stops. So we've really got to be attentive to their needs first and then work and build from there.
I just have a very small thing to add, and not related to my work, but related to somebody else's work. I was listening to a podcast, and it was about the work of the Clean Energy States Alliance and their effort to get solar on low and middle income homes in the Northeast. And they found similar issues in previous programs, that there was this trust issue and they weren't able to convince individuals to put solar on their roofs, but they developed this really neat campaign to build that community trust, and we're really successful in deploying solar on rooftops in low and middle income homes. I'll put that in the chat, but again, can't answer any questions about it, but it was just a really interesting program.
Thank you. Very insightful. And I have to say, even internationally, the pace and the pressure versus what is, feasible in the field to gain the minds and hearts of people to support this implementation. The implementation of electrification is is really a hot topic. And I think that we just don't have all the instruments yet really fine-tuned to be the most effective possible. Even the White House recognizes that. They have just an individual heat pump campaign embedded in the proper White House just for this purpose. So let's move on to next questions from Andy Young at City Fall Church in Virginia this time. I cannot hear you.
Is that better?
Yes, now it's better.
All right. Sorry about that. Thank you all for being here today. So my first question was related to David already kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'll throw it out again anyway. So the investment tax credit for geothermal projects and how that makes electrification strategies more viable. You know, we've got a project we're on the cusp of making a decision on, and how that tax credit plays out is going to be probably a big factor in whether we're able to do that or not. But since we've already kind of touched on that, my second question is, you know, what thoughts do y'all have on what building owners can do to, you know, better manage the complexity involved with more high efficient electrified systems? I think what even with kind of in our own inventory here, we're seeing, you know, systems that you turn off and on with the season, and then you go to these more sophisticated systems that are more efficient. Adopting and getting up to speed on those is a challenge. So two kind of different questions, but appreciate any thoughts y'all have. Thank you.
I'll start on the managing the complexity of electrification systems. I think, you know, when buildings are constructed or renovated, it's really important that the facilities manager is up to speed on how those systems work, because really the operation of buildings is where the rubber meets the road, and whether you see those utility bill reductions that you're hoping to achieve. And if a building is poorly operated and there's not enough staff time for a facilities manager to address those systems, then really you can see poorly performing buildings. I think two things I think can really help sort of make sure those systems are operating well. You want to, when they're first installed, you want to commission them to make sure they're operating as performed. That is a requirement for some building types in the code, but not other building types. And then if it's an existing building, doing a retro commissioning is really important to make sure those systems are operating as they should be operating. And you can really fine tune any like building automation system to make sure the set points and the, you know, fans are operating when they should be operating. So I would say commissioning and retro commissioning, and really giving the facility manager the staff and the time they need to, and the budget they need to really operate their buildings appropriately. I feel like facilities, oftentimes organizations and governments put a lot of funding in the construction of buildings, but very little funding for the operation and maintenance of those buildings. So I think making sure that there's sufficient funding and staff to do that operation and maintenance is really important.
I'll piggyback up very briefly off what Diana just mentioned, because I think she nailed it. I think there's an interesting opportunity again with in the electrification space. We're talking a lot about workforce development and training skilled workers on installation of heat pumps, on energy efficiency installations, et cetera. But that training for facilities managers, I think, is also really, really critically important. And thinking through what are ways that you could access, again, state, local, federal funding and create programs to specifically to train the facilities managers on these new efficient electric systems, because of all the reasons we just mentioned. It'll be new for some folks, and there are nuances to some of it. It'll just be different. It's not good or bad. It's just different. And so how to actually approach that can be really important. So finding ways and funding streams and opportunities to train folks on that in a consistent way, I think is again a big part of the puzzle as you're thinking systemically about how to decarbonize the sector. Yeah.
I don't
Any
have
other
any additions.
comments?
No, I have no other additions. Thank you, though.
Okay. Mr. Young, any other question?
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. The workforce development is an important one. Indeed, you're absolutely right. This is a completely new technology. It's a new technology for the building and how the electric part works also with other features of the building that are the sustainability of the retrofits of the building. I have here on the list Kate Retzer from WMATA with questions.
And Chair, I don't see WMATA on the line right now.
Okay, then we will put a loop in there, and I will go with my own question. That is something that I get every day here from Arlington, Virginia, almost every day. We approve new buildings, brand new buildings, built with not brand new codes. I have to tell you that in Virginia we have a problem with adopting and being, updated with the International Building Code. We are not. But we're trying our very, very best to get to a full electrified building. Yet, very often we're standing in front of a dilemma where the applicant says, "Well, we cannot completely do that. It doesn't pencil out for various reasons." And then they say, "But the building will be electric ready." So my question is, what are the what should an elected official or staff who works with these applications pay attention to when an applicant says the building will be electric ready? How ready can a building be for future retrofit?
I will take that question. So we developed electric ready requirements for the 2024 IACC. And when we say it's electric ready, we mean a couple things. For smaller equipment, it's actually quite straightforward. When you have a stove or a clothes dryer or a water heater, you want to make sure that you have that's combustion. You want to make sure you have an outlet near that combustion equipment that can power a future electric piece of equipment. Heat pump water heaters, for example, run on a clothes dryer outlet, a 240 volt outlet, but a gas water heater often runs on a regular 120 volt outlet. So you want to make sure that the location where the gas water heater has a 240 volt outlet. And for heat pump water heaters specifically, you also want to make sure there's enough space for air circulation, because heat pump water heaters heat the water from the surrounding air and exhaust cooler air, whereas gas water heaters don't do that. So that's just one example. For larger pieces of equipment, like if you have a commercial building with a boiler, that is a lot more difficult to make sure it's electric ready. Because as we said, those big boilers are difficult systems to retrofit. Currently, in the code, we are just requiring those buildings to at least have the electrical capacity to be able to power heat pumps. But in addition to that, if a building is truly, built to create an easy conversion to an electric system, you want to make sure there's space for future heat pump. Space is often a problem for central heat. If you're going to transition from a boiler to a central heat pump water heater, you want to make sure you have the space for the storage tanks for those future water heater, storage container. So that's a little bit more difficult to make sure it's like truly electric ready. The smaller system types, the unitized, like, the AC units, the smaller unitized water heaters, those are a lot easier to make sure they're truly electric ready. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other comments on this?
Just at a high level, I mean, if there's like an electric ready checklist that the administration can like have on hand just to verify that, so that confidently if the developer's coming to you and saying, no, we're ready to go, you can go to staff and be like, did it hit the checklist? Did we hit all our marks? I was like, or are they bullying us? Like, what's the actual thing here? So I don't know I won't dig into the exact process in your jurisdiction, but I feel like if you can have that sheet, and in San Diego for their climate action plan, they have a climate action plan checklist that developers have to fill out, and they have to check off all the things that they've done, and that's verified with planning and permitting. And that gives folks the assurance that, like, yeah, if you're going to get the benefits of, increased density or whatever it is that you're getting by completing this checklist, you actually have done that work, and we know that we can come in later and install those EV chargers or put in those, whatever exciting new technology that is scaled and is more affordable. So yeah, I would say like a checklist is an amazing tool.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Actually, I have one member of our staff is here on the call. Ms. McBride is here. She's going through many checklists, I can tell you that. Maybe she has a question or two.
First, on behalf of Arlington County, and thank you to our key liaison in these matters, Board Member Karen Tonis, sorry. And thank you to the COG and to the committee for setting this up. As you can tell, this is a regional priority objective of all of the jurisdictions and agencies. I just want to clarify, because I know that Board Member Karen Tonis had one question. So am I going to just prioritize one of the very long list of questions that we have?
We don't have endless time.
Okay. One of the, kind of major challenges that we have is dealing with the utility and really sitting down and having a very fulsome and meaningful and reliable conversation about their build out plans. So can you give an example maybe of best practices or the best way to approach negotiating and maybe massaging that intransigence on future planning for capacity, because we have this for both our buildings and for transportation electrification. And Dominion has been very closed about, number one, the complete, very, very largely aggregated data that they give us generally for our greenhouse gas inventories, but definitely for future planning and even for, risk mitigation planning for energy assurance. So any help or any examples that you have in that regard would be helpful. Thank you.
I'll jump in briefly. Hopefully I'm brief. Anyway, I think this is such a huge question, and I really appreciate it. So one area that we've seen some success with utilities coming to the table more and planning out and sharing information about future plans is through work with the utility commission at the state. And so I know in Washington, D.C. and in Maryland, this has come up a bunch. I admit I'm a little bit less familiar with what's all the details in Virginia with the Utility Commission on future planning for responding to climate action plans. And so we've seen future of gas distribution proceedings and dockets land in different utility commissions that typically translates into bringing the electric utility or the dual fuel utility into the table too, to talk about the grid planning as well. And so again, I know in Washington, D.C., there's a proceeding that's ongoing around it, and it has come up multiple times in Maryland in different proceedings around efficiency, around climate action plan, et cetera. And we've seen this in a number of other states too. It's not just here in the Mid-Atlantic. So having some facilitation with utility commissioners, with utility commission staff, and either having formal proceedings initiated or at least having some working group discussions kicked off is usually one way to help that process move forward. And on the issue of utility data, I'm sure Matthew and Diana have some thoughts on this too, but I know that in some of the federal programs that are flowing down, there are additional requirements around utility data transparency. And again, we're waiting for more information from the federal government on how those will exactly work, as with a lot of those programs. But as those come out, we'll be sure that every information it can be shared. But there's just some of the initial thoughts. Could have a more deeper conversation. Happy to have some follow-ups on it. But I don't know, Matthew or Diana, if you have other thoughts you wanted to bring in.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if Kate Retzer from WMATA is back on the meeting. Probably not. I cannot see her. Ms. McBride's your question covered some of what Ms. Retzer had advanced already as questions. One other that she had, and I think it's an important one because we read a lot about this. So the question was, what technologies are currently available for electric backup power to replace diesel generators?
Thank you.
And I know that these are we in the region we have had many examples where diesel generators as backup power devices or they are proposed as inappealable. What are backup generator solutions, alternative?
I'll take that question. So for smaller building types, a lot of we've seen a large growth in the installation of battery energy storage systems. Unfortunately, these battery energy storage systems like your Tesla Powerwall are still quite expensive. Costs are going down though. They've rapidly decreased recently, just like solar has decreased. In addition, the IRA just released funding and tax credits to install these battery systems, so costs are declining. Battery systems, unlike diesel generators, because they're so expensive and you install, I guess, fewer of them, they usually don't provide backup power for as long as a diesel generator can provide backup power. Usually if you install like one Tesla Powerwall for a home, it can provide backup power for your critical needs like your refrigerator, etc. For just a few hours to power a full home, you probably need 4 of them, which can be quite expensive. A lot of larger building types like hospitals are required by code to have diesel generators that can power that building for multiple days. Thus far, I haven't seen any hospitals like invest in battery energy storage systems to replace those diesel energy generators, just because it would require a lot of space and be very expensive. However, those hospitals could install like battery energy storage systems to reduce the amount of time those diesel generators have to be on when there is a power outage. So I'd say, we will slowly transition from backing up our buildings with diesel to batteries. I think it's really good for outdoor air quality to do that, especially because diesel generators are just so they pollute a lot. So I'm trying to think. Yeah, that's how I would answer that question. Slowly transitioning from diesel to battery energy storage.
Thank you. Any other comments on that before we go to the next question? None. Let's go ahead with Randy Fried from the Citizen Climate Lobby. Also, folks, if you are not speaking, please mute yourself so that we can manage the meeting best. So, Mr. Fried.
Thank you, Chair Karantonis. I'd like to pose a question that's related to Dimitri's question. I chair the Sustainability Commission in Prince William County, and we're developing a climate action plan that will almost certainly include building electrification. So I'd like to get some help in addressing a concern that I think we will hear when we recommend this. Our utility, Dominion, is projecting very high electric demand growth over the next 15 years, due mostly to rapid growth in data centers and, of course, lots of additional EVs in the vehicle fleet. To my knowledge, their demand projection doesn't incorporate much building electrification. Now, based on the demand projection they have, they're saying that this fast growth is going to make it impossible to retire a couple of coal plants in their generation mix that they otherwise would have retired. And it's also going to require them to add a couple of new natural gas plants in addition to a lot of solar and wind that they're planning to bring in. So my question is this: if we accelerate building electrification and that slows the pace of decarbonizing the grid, can we be sure that we're actually reducing carbon emissions in a cost-effective way? Thanks.
Thank you. So,
Randy, I don't know if I have the full answer to your question, but I'll say one thing. Compared to the need for electrical capacity. So just as history, the 2024 IECCM committee member has included requirements not only for or incentives for building electrification, but is for the first time including requirements for EV infrastructure in new buildings. And when you compare the electrical capacity requirements for electric vehicles with the needed electrical capacity for building electrification, it pales. Like there's probably a factor of 10 or 20 times in terms of the need for additional electrical capacity. So I wouldn't say that building electrification should be disincentivized because you're worried about electrical demand. And I wouldn't say too that we should disincentivize electrifying transport either. Electric vehicles, we are with the grid we have, reduces carbon emissions across the United States. If you move to electric vehicles and building electrification as well with the grid we have. I think David, RMI did a study on replacing furnaces with heat pumps and found that in all 48 states with the current grid that was a beneficial, would be beneficial for reduced carbon emissions with the grid we currently have. And I would hope that Dominion would take advantage of many of the tax incentives in the IRA to change their plan to maybe not build those natural gas power plants and instead build more renewable energy capacity. That would be my hope, personally.
thank you. Any other comments on that?
I was simply going to mention the analysis that Diana mentioned. I just put it in the chat. We do showcase how switching to heat pump, air source heat pump for space heating and heat pump for water heating does reduce emissions in all 48 states in year 1 and then through year 15. It's based on some NREL data and projections for the grid. And I would also, the only other thing I'd mention is again, factoring in the Inflation Reduction Act incentives for the electricity sector, which has a much higher level of investment opportunity than even the building sector, for sure, and how that changes the economics for clean energy deployment across the country, and how that will actually increase those resources on the grid. But it sounds like you guys are going to be talking a lot more about grid build out and transition in some future calls. So that's all I'll mention.
Yeah, thank you. And one additional wrinkle, and it sounds like your analysis addresses this. I can easily understand how even with a fairly fossil fuel intensive grid, that EVs could be big greenhouse gas winners, because I know that the system efficiency for most internal combustion engines is only about 22% or something like that. And for natural gas plants, converting gas to electricity and then going into the battery of an electric vehicle has a much better efficiency than that. But it strikes me that with buildings, particularly if we're talking about heating, you know, burning natural gas for fuel within a building probably has pretty decent system efficiency compared to burning gas, turning it into electricity, sending it through the transmission line, and then using the gas, using the electricity to come up with heat. But if what you're saying is that the heat pump analysis kind of covers all that, and overall the system efficiency is still in your favor, that's kind of good news. Is that basically what you're saying?
Yeah, Ren or David, maybe you should answer.
Feel free to go, Diana. I'll add anything at the end.
Yeah, so heat pumps, electric resistance heat, that may be a concern in some states. You know, using electric resistance heat, which goes up to 100% efficient, could result in more carbon emissions if you're powering it with electricity from a relatively dirty grid. Fortunately, heat pumps are 3 times more efficient on average compared to electric resistance heat. So because if you transition from a combustion piece of equipment to a heat pump for either space heating or water heating, you are definitely going to see reduced carbon emissions. I'll also add that a lot of buildings install electric resistance water heaters, especially smaller electric resistance water heaters. There's not a lot of market penetration for heat pump water heaters, but the Department of Energy actually last week released a appliance efficiency standard that would transition that entire market to heat pump water heaters in, I would guess, roughly 3 to 4 years for both new and existing buildings. So that won't be a problem in the short-term future.
Thank you. We're a little bit under time constraints. Let's go to the next questions. Melissa Adams with Washington Gas. Is Melissa with us? Let me jump over to Valeria Moore from the city of Alexandria with questions. So we don't have them here. They submit. Is there any other member or participant in this meeting who wants to pose a question? You can do that now before we close. Dimitra, I see you.
Sorry, and I hope this is a quick answer if you can. In geothermal, as you know, we have some jurisdictions, ours included. They're geographically very small, so we deal with constrained spaces in urbanized, very dense development throughout most of the county. So in terms of geothermal, are there key limitations or best practices? We would like to explore that. It's been used with our schools, but they have obviously larger spaces to work with. So are you finding kind of strategies that work in similarly dense urban development?
Any reactions?
Mitra, I'm not an expert on geothermal systems. However, I will say that the air source heat pumps are increasingly becoming more common in the technology of choice in many existing buildings, just because they are both really efficient and easy to retrofit with. Geothermal systems, you usually have to dig in wells, which can be relatively expensive. However, there's a new tax credit, and they are really efficient systems as well. So I would encourage you to look into both system types.
Great, thank you.
So I know we can sit here for many, many hours and discuss a lot. I mean, we had also a very long list of other questions. But we are a little bit time constrained on this
Pardon
meeting.
me, Takis, it's Melissa Adams. I'm sorry, I was
Oh,
unable to
there you
unmute
go. What you
myself.
got?
So thank
Not
you.
the last question, Melissa.
Okay, so I just wanted to, well, just follow up on what was just mentioned, that actually gas heat pumps are on the horizon in terms of commercialization and have many of the efficiency features that were, previously mentioned, as well as the fact that, they direct combust gas, so there's less loss of energy. But my question actually for the team is, can you share a little bit more about what your electrical capacity requirements and assumptions are with respect to both, the capacity and cost of having, say, a gas home be able to electrify and convert to electricity using, all the standard appliances, furnace, hot water, a cooktop, dryer, and also accommodating a level 2 charger?
Melissa, I'll try and take that question. So obviously one of the sort of more expensive things to retrofit if you're converting to from a gas home to an electric home is the electrical panel and the capacity of that panel. Fortunately, there are smart panels that allow systems to share loads. There are also smart circuit breakers that allow circuits to share loads. So oftentimes, a contractor may tell you that you need to upgrade your electrical panel to serve these the new electrical equipment, but sometimes you actually don't. I will also say that when you're calculating what that electric panel capacity should be, sometimes you can use conservative estimates based on a certain methodology in the National Electrical Code. There's another method of calculating your electric load in existing buildings where you use the existing electric bills in those buildings, and you actually can look at how that building is using electricity to determine whether you need to upgrade the electrical panel when you're, for example, replacing your furnace with a heat pump. So we've seen, older homes sometimes have 100 amp panels, and we've seen those homes go fully electric without having to update that panel. So it's very possible to do that. I'll also say that the Inflation Reduction Act also provided incentives for both rewiring homes and for electric panel upgrades. So hopefully that retrofit is less expensive now that we have federal funding for it.
Thank you. I will ask the panelists if you have any final remarks, like a minute or so. We're a little bit over time, but I think we are more than grateful for your presence here and for this very vigorous conversation today. It's definitely going to be the first of many. Thank you so much. If you have any closing remarks, open to share them.
I'll jump in first, and then Diana and Matthew, feel free to jump in. Two things to close on. Love the last question and your response, Diana. I think the other thing that I would mention as a whole, as we talked about forward planning and transition planning here, is to think also about what the cost is, not just for retrofitting the existing building stock to electrify it, but what the costs are for those that are remaining on fossil fuel systems. And there's been some discussion around that, I know, in different states, and the consumer advocates, People's Council have put out reports on some of those things. I know in Maryland, and I think maybe in DC as well, but in across the space. So thinking about it holistically from a climate perspective and what future costs are on different systems is important. And my last piece is just keep having these kinds of conversations, because I mentioned it when I first joined the call before most of you joined. This region is on the forefront of a lot of these conversations, along with some cities and jurisdictions on the West Coast and others in the Northeast. But we're tackling the hardest issues now. We've got 25 years to do it. So we're starting now. We've got a lot more work to do, but just I commend you all for having this kind of discussion and diving deep into the issues, and look forward to working with you all to close it out. It should be a lot of fun over the next 20 plus years.
Matthew?
Yeah, well, just a deep appreciation for this body and this forum being focused on this issue. It's incredibly complex, it's economic, it's political, it's social, and it's imperative that you continue to have these conversations with all the important stakeholders, and first and foremost, those communities that have traditionally not been part of these discussions, since they will be the ones who could potentially be left behind, as David elevated. And I think another important cost to kind of just at a high level factor is like, what's the cost if we don't do it? Like, what if we don't follow through on these projects? And that leads us to a lot of scary outcomes. So I really appreciate the seriousness and the intention here, because it is a very important piece for us to address the climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent panel, excellent conversation. Thank you for being here with us and sharing your expertise and your thoughts. And also thank you to COG staff for having put all this together. I trust that we will be, harvesting all the questions and the chat and everything, and we will make them, available in a way that, continues this conversation in written form as an outflow of and takeaway from this meeting in the coming weeks or so. Thank you again. It's now time we're a little bit over time, 5 minutes or so, and the last part of our agenda today is to hear about the proposed EPA power plant rule that is kind of very, very, there is a segue there. We're hearing from Riaz Mohammad, who is he's a lead on this and the EPA power plant rule with the Edison Electric Institute, and will share his knowledge with us today. Comments are on this rule are due relatively soon, on August the 8th. So Riaz, the floor is yours.
Morning, everyone. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
We can hear you very well.
Thank you for inviting me this morning to discuss EPA's proposed Clean Air Act Section 111 proposed rules, or the power plant rule. As already mentioned, my name is Riaz Mohammed. I'm a Senior Director of Resiliency and Environmental Policy at the Edison Electric Institute. And for those of you that don't know, EEI is the National Trade Association that represents investor-owned electric utilities. Therefore, our members would be the ones directly regulated by this proposed rule. So we have dug into it. It's a pretty complex rule. What I hope to do today, in probably about 15 minutes, I won't take that long, is just do a high-level overview of what's in the proposal, open up for questions there, and then just kind of lay out where we're seeing kind of the tension points in the proposed rule, and just highlight those for you today. So with that, if you don't mind going to the next slide, I think before we start a conversation, it might be helpful to just do a little bit of background. So this is the third time in the last decade that EPA is proposing Section 111 rules for power plants. We went back to the Obama administration, who did the Clean Power Plan. That was rescinded by the Trump administration, who put in the Affordable Clean Energy Rule, which is going to be repealed by this proposed rule. And then we have the current rule in front of us, which really is made up of 4 distinct parts. So we have the 111 rule for existing steam EGUs, so those are your coal power plants. You have your 111D rule for existing gas units. You have your 111B rule for new gas units. And as I mentioned, there's also the element that is the repeal of the ACE rule, which I'm not going to talk about today. I think that one's pretty straightforward in terms of why they're having to repeal the ACE rule before they put in the new rules. So just talking a little bit about that. If you want to go to the next slide, before we get into a discussion of the elements of the proposed rule, I think it's helpful to kind of take a look at where the carbon emission reductions are taking place in the electric sector. So as of 2022, the last year that we have full data, on the whole, the electric power industry is about 36% below 2005 levels. That far exceeds what would have been required under the Clean Power Plan. And all trends indicate that this is going to continue as we retire higher emitting generating resources, bring on more renewables and other carbon-free generation sources. So in the context of looking at the proposed rule, our members are looking at how can that rule continue this transition in a way that makes sense when always keeping kind of reliability and affordability top of mind. So with that in mind, we can go through to the next slide, and I will go ahead and apologize to begin with. This is a very busy chart, but what I wanted to do for you guys is kind of put all the proposed standards in one place so you could see them. So hopefully this is coming through and you guys can see it, and I'll walk through each of these in more detail. So just by way of background, the way that EPA sets its standards under Clean Air Act Section 111 is kind of, they base a numeric number on the installation and operation of specific technology that is adequately demonstrated and achievable by the industry. So I think we'll come back to those two terms in a little bit, just in terms of where we're seeing some tension points around the proposed rule. So just walking through, and I'll start from the bottom and work my way up, is we have standards for new gas units. So these are the 111B standards. So what EPA did in their proposed rule was break the units into 3 different subcategories. You have your baseload units that they expect to operate, more frequently. You have your intermediate units. Those are kind of, anywhere between 45 and 55% capacity factor. And your low utilization units. Those are ones that are really supposed to come on during high demand events. So based off of the subcategory, each one has its own limit. For low load utilization, it's just use of clean fuels. For intermediate, if you're operating between now and December 31st, 2031, it's just efficient operations, and then past and starting in 2032, you have 30% hydrogen co-blending by volume. For baseload units, they presented kind of a dual pathway compliance option. So you can either do a CCS or carbon capture and sequestration option. That would allow you in 2035 to install that technology. If you were doing a hydrogen blending by volume pathway, in 2032, you would have to blend 30% hydrogen. And then in 2035, you would have to blend 96% hydrogen. And then below that, you have kind of the reflective emission rates that you would need to meet on a unit basis. So that is how they designed their proposed standards for new gas units. For existing gas units, it will look very similar to what they did for the new gas units. If you're going to go the CCS option, by 2035, you have to have a 90% capture rate. If you're doing the hydrogen blending option, in 2032, you have to do 30% blending, and then 2035, you have to do 96% blending. So that's kind of how they did the gas, both new and existing gas. And then for existing coal, they did subcategories based on when the unit was expected to retire. As you can imagine, for units that are anticipating to operate past 2040, those are the most stringent limits, and then they get stepped down from there based off of the retirement date. Basically, if you're going to retire by 2031, you have very little requirements until 2030 when you have to do routine operations. If you're going to retire by 2034, you have to do a capacity factor restriction. And if you're going to retire by 2039, you just have to do natural gas co-firing. So I know that was a lot of information on the standards for all the different units. So I will stop here and see if anyone has questions before I go on to identifying some of the questions that we know will come up, both in comments filed by everybody as well as potential litigation down the line. So I'll stop there and see if there are questions.
Thank you, Riaz. Any questions?
I'm curious, did they speak to the feasibility of the hydrogen blending?
So that is one of the big issues that I know we're looking at, because it's not reflected on this chart, but it's not just hydrogen blending. It has to be low greenhouse gas hydrogen. which is something that is not yet defined by the IRA, but we're waiting for Treasury and IRS to define what that is. So there's a lot of feasibility questions around the availability of hydrogen, especially low greenhouse gas hydrogen, at the scale and scope that they are thinking there will be by 2032. And a lot of questions around kind of the infrastructure needed to get that hydrogen to different parts of the country.
Excellent question. Any other questions? I don't see any. So Riaz, I guess you can proceed.
Yeah. So there are a lot of different stakeholders in this space. And some of the kind of concerns that we've been hearing or tension points that we've been hearing kind of break down into two different categories. We have kind of legal issues and then technical issues. So I'll start with the legal issues. So as I mentioned, the way that EPA sets its emission limits is on the best system of emission reduction. And that requires two things. One, that the technology is adequately demonstrated, and that the emission rate that they set is achievable by the whole industry. So the question that was posed kind of got to the first issue, and it's whether or not both CCS and hydrogen co-blending, especially with low greenhouse gas hydrogen co-blending, are adequately demonstrated at this time. So the way that the Clean Air Act works is that especially for new units, the standard is effective upon proposal. That is so that you don't have people going out there and trying to build new units before a final rule. So looking at that in terms of, is the technology adequately demonstrated right now? Looking at the record, both that EPA provided in their proposed rule, as well as the technical support documents that they posted on their docket, there are open questions about whether or not, the use of studies, pilot data, and projects that are not at full scale represent a technology that is adequately demonstrated. So I think that's a question that a lot of people are grappling with in terms of the way that EPA proposed this rule. They're kind of, yes, they don't come effective until 2032 or 2035, but there's a lot of projection there based off currently nascent or, very infantile technology that those will be fully available by the scale and scope that they need by those dates. So those are some of the questions that we're grappling with. In addition to that, both for CCS and hydrogen, there's a lot of pipelines that would need to be built. I think there's a question about whether or not we can adequately build the necessary infrastructure and pipelines to support these technologies, just given kind of the challenges we're facing right now with studying and permitting of critical energy. There's also a question around the approach that EPA is taking. So this is the first time for a 111 rule that EPA has taken this phased approach. Normally they just set one BSER, best system of emission reduction, and one emission rate, and that is how they've done it in the past. This phased approach where you have a limit between now and 2031, and then 2032 you have a different limit, or 2035 you have a different limit. There's questions of whether or not this approach is consistent with EPA statutory authority. I think you're going to see a lot of people commenting on that they can't do this phased approach, and they probably are in a better spot just doing one limit based off of one technology. And then there's an additional legal question. If you look at the chart, the standards for both new and existing gas, they look exactly identical. I'm not sure that that's the way that Congress envisioned having EPA set standards. There's a recognition that it's much harder to retrofit an existing facility to incorporate technology than there is when you're doing a new build. So I think there's some questions around kind of that part of the proposal where new and existing gas have the same kind of emission limits. So getting to some technical concerns, I think we hit on some of them. The hydrogen and CCS options, they require a lot of infrastructure to do that. So, whether the turbines, so for hydrogen blending, I don't think we have the turbine technology where it is right now to integrate either 30 or 96% hydrogen blending. So that's kind of a industry that needs to be built out. I already talked about, pipeline capacity. There's also a question of whether or not there are enough raw materials out there to produce the electrolyzers that you would need to produce hydrogen at this level, especially low greenhouse gas hydrogen. So I think they're just the components of both the CCS and a hydrogen blending system. There are a lot of technical questions around whether or not those are feasible now and whether or not they'd be ready by 2032 or 2035. Another technical question is around the 770 limit that they set for baseload natural gas units. That seems to be a pretty tight limit that really doesn't reflect not only how those units are going to operate currently, but especially into the future as we start to integrate more renewable generating sources. So I think, there might be a necessary limit to increase that limit just enough to account for the way that those units are going to operate in the future. So those are only some of the issues that we're seeing out there as we, start to join in conversations with other stakeholders and others that are kind of reviewing this proposal. So again, I'll stop and see if there are any questions about either the standards themselves or kind of the tension points that we're starting to see around the proposal.
Thank you. Any questions at this point? I recognize this is highly technical, so you may not get questions right away at first contact, so you will probably get them a little bit later. I guess since there are none that I can see, at least in the virtual room, let's proceed.
That is all I had for today, so I'm happy to turn it back over to my others. And my email is on the title slide of this presentation if people do have questions after the fact.
Before we entertain more questions or clarifications, can you or COG staff tell us what the process of providing comments by August the 8th looks like?
Yeah, so EPA on the Federal Register provided a link to regulations.gov, and you can just submit your comments through there. If you go to regulations.gov and just search, I think the rule is actually called New Source Performance Standards for Greenhouse Gas Emissions from New, Modified, and Reconstructed Fossil Fuel-Fired Electric Generating Units, Emission Guidelines for Greenhouse Gas Emissions from Existing Fossil-Fired Electric Generating Units, and Repeal of the Affordable Clean Energy Rules. So if you just look that up, type that up. I'm sure if you type repeal of ACE, it might come up in there as well. But yeah, just go to regulations.gov and then it will just have a comment button below and you can just submit your comments there.
So I guess I will open the floor for questions to Riaz. If there are any. Melissa, I see you.
Oh, no questions. Thank you.
Okay. That's a tricky business to blend hydrogen into, and then on top of that, expecting that the hydrogen is low carbon produced. That's quite a challenge for at least our generation mix in our country. So are there any other comments on this item?
Just on that point, so DOE has put out solicitations for hydrogen hubs across the countries, and a lot of our members, it's a competitive process, but a lot of our members have submitted applications and have been awarded some of those. So it's something that collectively industry and government are working on, and a lot of that was provided through funding from IIJ and IRA.
Yeah, and our region actually is one of the areas that actually desires to have to become such a hub. We are inactive. We had some conversations and some presentations on that in the the recent past, not so far back. At some point, we may get an update on this. Are there any other items that need to be discussed here at this meeting? We're coming close to our.
Yeah, I guess, Takis, I guess the question from staff to your point about, process for getting a comment in, we, normally on a topic like this, we would run this issue through the technical committee, so either BAC or the Metropolitan Washington Air Quality Committee's Technical Advisory Committee. Both, Tim Masters and Robert Christopher take the lead on kind of the CEEPC advocacy letters or comment letters. On this one, in discussions with Tim and Robert, I think there was, it was less clear to staff that this was a particular rulemaking that we, wanted to dive into full force and have a COG comment, particularly given, the technical complexities, and it wasn't kind of a slam dunk as some of the other, federal initiatives that we've commented on. So I guess we'd be looking for CEEPC direction on this. If there was strong, if there was a motion and a second and a strong kind of unanimous sense that, boy, we really should be commenting on it, we could scramble and do a draft letter and circulate it. The timing is clearly not in our favor, given how soon the deadline for comments is. So I think that's, our staff recommendation would probably be to maybe sit this one out and see how it plays out. And there's going to be enough other commenters out there on this. That
was my second question would be, is there any appetite from any member jurisdiction to try to draft a comment on the EPA rule, the power plant rule? Probably not. I don't see any significant hands. I mean, any hands or any appetite at this moment. I understand that this is quite technical at this point, and maybe not. Maybe it's better to see how this plays out at this level of consultation of the EPA, and then weigh in when we see a more clear direction of the agency towards this rule. I don't think that this is a minor issue. I think this is a major issue because we talk a lot about, how we power our grid. We heard already today how important this is, on both sides of the equation, whether the grid is delivering sufficient capacity and how this capacity is going to be fueled, how this capacity is going to be generated. What's the carbon mix of that? So this EPA rule is not irrelevant here. It's really a relevant piece. But I think I would agree with at this point with the level of discussion we've had with staff at COG, that we want to see how this plays out first, and then weigh in in a second round of comments and consultations. So if anybody wants to speak on this, please feel free to say so. If not, I will move to adjourn the meeting because we're already getting to our noon end time for today. And I want to thank everybody for having been today here in this meeting, and for the vigorous participation in the conversation today. That was really very helpful. It structured my mind in many ways I didn't anticipate before, so thank you for this. We are meeting next on Wednesday, September the 27th at 10 p.m. And then there's another meeting. This is an in-person meeting with a hybrid option. So with a virtual option. And then November 15th is the meeting after that. So September 27th, 10 a.m. I hope to see everybody there. I wish you a very pleasant, as much as possible, pleasant, restful, nourishing rest of the summer. And I will see you in the fall. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Maya and Jeff, as always, big thank you to you as well. And we'll be talking about summarizing a little bit the insights from today. Thank you.